Hello, here is part 2 of our lecture on the origin of the eukaryotes. So we talked about mitochondria and the fact that they have genomes, and their genes and their genomes place them in the tree of the bacteria. And now here are a few words about the chloroplasts. So chloroplasts are also organelles of eukaryotes. The major difference to the mitochondria is that the chloroplasts are not found in all of the eukaryotes. The chloroplasts are only found in some, specifically those that do photosynthesis. Chloroplasts are the organelles in eukaryotes that enable photosynthesis to occur. And if you sequence the genes, specifically the 16S ribosomal RNA gene, which is the gene that we keep mentioning when we talk about the tree of life, you find out that their genes in the chloroplasts are nearly identical to cyanobacteria. So once again, the cyanobacteria are playing an important role in the story that we're telling about the history of life on Earth. We've previously talked about them as the culprits who caused the great oxidation event, and they are also the ancestors of the chloroplasts. So you can think of plants, for example, the trees in the forest are doing photosynthesis because they have cyanobacteria enslaved as organelles inside their cells. And the photosynthesis that green plants are performing is really a cyanobacterial metabolism. It's a bacterial metabolism invented by the cyanobacteria. And the only reason trees can do photosynthesis is because they have these chloroplasts that are derived from cyanobacteria. Okay? So let's think about this from an ecological perspective. So obviously this is a deep evolutionary story of how the mitochondria and chloroplasts came to be, and it's obviously a cell biology story. But it's interesting to think about the ecology that was going on that led to these evolutionary events. So we've previously talked about the microbial loop. This is my cartoon of the microbial loop, where we have these green phytoplankton. Many of the phytoplankton, especially billions of years ago on the ancient Earth, they would have been cyanobacteria. They are, we still have cyanobacteria today, and a long time ago they would have been even more abundant, fixing CO2 into organic matter and releasing oxygen. And we talked about how in the microbial loop there would have been aerobic, heterotrophic bacteria decomposing and respiring this organic matter back to CO2 and consuming oxygen, and these two are inverse processes of each other, right? And so it's interesting to think about how this microbial loop that has probably been going on for billions and billions of years, two of the most important players of that microbial loop seem to be the ancestors of the chloroplasts and the mitochondria. The photoautotrophs in this story became the chloroplasts, and the heterotrophs in this story became mitochondria. Now, I don't know exactly how this occurred. Nobody does. Nobody knows exactly how the mitochondria and chloroplasts came to be enslaved as endosymbionts in eukaryotes, but I think this is a really important clue to try to figure that out. So hopefully it's helpful to tie these very different concepts in this class together like this. So let's think a little bit more about maybe what were the evolutionary pressures, the selection pressures for this to happen. So first, let's notice that eukaryotic cells tend to be much larger than prokaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are usually in the tens of microns in diameter, often 100 microns in diameter. Bacteria and archaea are roughly 1 or 2 microns in diameter, so much, much, much smaller, right? In order to grow that big, we've previously talked about the constraints of the surface area to volume ratio, right? That is, a larger cell is less able to transport food and waste in and out of its cell merely by diffusion. A small cell is very efficient in taking advantage of diffusion. A large cell is not efficient. So it needs to spend energy to bring food in and to make waste leave, right? It's got to do some work to make its large cell viable, right? As the eukaryotic cell started getting bigger, it's going to need more energy to maintain that large, complicated cell. Once the great oxidation event occurred and there were aerobic bacteria floating around in the ocean and perhaps on land, it's not clear how much land there was back then, it would have been advantageous if these large, clumsy eukaryotes could have taken advantage of the fact that these bacteria had invented a way to take advantage of all of that poisonous oxygen that was now filling the world. So that's the idea, that the first mitochondrial endosymbiotic event, the acquisition of a aerobic heterotrophic bacterium and conversion of it into a mitochondria in an ancestor of the eukaryotes, was probably because of energy. That doing so gave it access to an energy source, and specifically an electron acceptor that was becoming much more abundant and enabling the cell to get a lot more energy from the same food. Perhaps that was required for the eukaryotic cell to grow as big as it is today. So that's the idea. So first, let's pause to make sure that you're all with me and you've gotten the most important points about what we've talked about today. So here's a clicker question. Because this is a recorded video, no worries, we're not actually using the clickers, but let's just pretend that this is a clicker question and think about where in this standard diagram of the eukaryotic cell, where would you find bacterial DNA? That is DNA that is derived from a phylogeny of bacteria, that if you sequence that DNA, it would be placed in the phylogeny of the bacteria. So think for 3 seconds, pause the video, touch your screen. Where would you find DNA of bacterial origin? Okay, the answer is in these mitochondria. Here, these are the mitochondria. The mitochondria have genomes. Their genes place them in the phylogeny of the bacteria, which is the most direct, strongest evidence that mitochondria are of bacterial origin. Here's another diagram of a eukaryotic cell. This happens to be a cell of a plant, which you can see by the cell wall. Plants have cell walls, right? And in addition to mitochondria, they also have chloroplasts. This is a common mistake that students make. It's common to think that plants have chloroplasts instead of mitochondria, which is not true. All eukaryotes have mitochondria. All eukaryotes have mitochondria. In addition, plants also have chloroplasts, okay? That's a really important observation, that plants have both mitochondria and chloroplasts. And so if this were a real clicker question, which parts of the diagram would include DNA of bacterial origin? Pause the video for a few seconds, think about it. And the answer is here in the mitochondria and also here in the chloroplasts. So both the chloroplasts and the mitochondria have DNA of bacterial origin. Eukaryotes that are not plants do have mitochondria. They do not have chloroplasts, but they do have mitochondria. Plants have both. Good. That's the end of part 2. I'll see you in part 3.